The prison was a fortress of steel and concrete, a place where the worst of society were thrown to rot, where time moved slowly, and justice often came in the form of blood and silence. It was a world within a world, cut off from the lives of ordinary people. Behind these walls, a different kind of justice was about to unfold, swift, brutal, and final. The 20 men had arrived at the facility just a few days earlier. Each of them had been convicted of crimes so vile that even the most hardened criminals despised them. They were child molesters, men who had preyed on the innocent, who had destroyed lives in ways no punishment could ever truly rectify. The guards knew it, the inmates knew it, and in this prison, crimes against children were the one thing no one forgave. At first, the 20 men had been placed in protective custody. It was standard procedure. The prison system understood the unwritten rule. Child predators did not survive long behind bars. They were segregated, placed in a unit where their only interactions were with each other, where they were shielded from the general population. But somehow, something went wrong. A prison without mercy. The facility itself was notorious. Located in a remote part of the state, it had a reputation for being one of the harshest maximum security prisons in the country. Inmates who ended up here were either the most violent offenders or those deemed too dangerous for lower security institutions. Murderers, gang leaders, and lifers called this place home. For them, violence was a way of life. Power was measured by fear, and survival depended on the alliances one made. The only thing that could unify such men who had stabbed, shot, and tortured their way through life, was a common enemy. Child molesters were that enemy. The arrival of 20 of them at once was unprecedented. They had all been convicted in a massive statewide crackdown. Some had operated alone, others as part of underground rings. Their crimes had spanned decades. Victims had been as young as infants. Their cases had been all over the news, their faces shown repeatedly, their names cursed by the public. Prisoners rarely watched the news, but the guards did, and they talked. By the time the 20 men were processed and placed in protective custody, the entire prison knew who they were. The set-up protective custody was supposed to keep them safe. It was a unit separate from the general population, secured by additional locks, with limited interactions between inmates. Meals were brought to them. They had no access to the yard. But inside a prison like this, walls could only do so much. It started with whispers. Guards speaking in hushed tones, their conversations cut short when certain officers passed by. Inmates who worked in the kitchen were seen talking to others who had no business being near protective custody. Even the prison librarian, an older convict who had long earned the respect of the yard, had been seen staring at the door leading to their unit. Something was being planned, and yet, the 20 men had no idea. They sat in their small cells, some still in shock from their sentencing. They were not hardened criminals. Most had never been in prison before. Some had been respected men on the outside, teachers, priests, family men. Now they were the lowest of the low. One of them, a former youth pastor named Gregory Lyles, had spent his time praying, clutching a Bible as if it could save him. Another, a retired schoolteacher named Harold Vance, had barely spoken since he arrived, his face permanently pale, his body trembling. They all knew the stories. They knew what happened to men like them in places like this. What they didn't know was that their time was up, the breach. The night it happened was like any other. The prison echoed with the usual sounds, shouting from distant cells, the occasional clank of metal against concrete, the murmur of voices plotting in the dark. The guards patrolled the halls, their footsteps routine, their eyes scanning the cells with the practiced indifference of men who had long stopped being surprised by the violence around them. Then, all at once, it began. It was as if a silent signal had been given. In the span of minutes, chaos erupted. The protective custody unit, which had been beaten, their skulls cracked against the cold prison floors. A few were strangled, their gasps for air lost in the overwhelming noise of the riot. One man tried to run. He made it halfway down the corridor before a gang leader named Diaz grabbed him, slammed him against the bars, and cut his throat with a piece of sharpened metal. Another man, the former pastor, fell to his knees, sobbing, begging for mercy. He got none. By the time reinforcements arrived, it was over. Aftermath. 20 lifeless bodies lay in the cell block, their deaths swift and merciless. The men responsible stood among them, their faces unreadable. They didn't run, they didn't fight. They simply stood there waiting for the guards to do what they must. Interviews were conducted. Questions were asked. How had this happened? Who had orchestrated it? But the answers remained elusive. The prisoners who had carried out the killings refused to speak. The other inmates, even those uninvolved, maintained a code of silence. No one mourned. No one sought justice for the dead. Outside the prison walls, reactions were mixed. Some condemned the violence, insisting that even the worst criminals deserved due process. Others, particularly those who had suffered at the hands of men like these, felt a dark sense of satisfaction. For the families of the victims, those whose children had been hurt by these men, it was a moment of closure they had never expected. No lengthy appeals, no early releases, no chance for these men to harm again. Justice, in its most primal form, had been served. The prison warden issued a statement calling it an unfortunate and regrettable incident. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something unspoken, that suggested he did not truly mourn their passing. The case was investigated, reports were written, but in the end, no one was ever charged. The truth, whatever it was buried beneath layers of silence, beneath the unspoken understanding that sometimes justice found its own way. And so, the prison gates remained closed, the walls standing tall, and life within its confines continued. But for those who had witnessed that night, for those who had seen what justice could look like when stripped of its formalities, one truth remained. In the world of the condemned, there were still lines that could not be crossed, still crimes too terrible to be forgiven. And for those 20 men, mercy had not been an option.